Hey everyone, welcome to the fourth installment of the Future Grind podcast. I'm your host, Ryan O'Shea, and today we are joined by U.S. presidential candidate Zoltan Istvan. Zoltan is the author of the award-winning sci-fi novel, The Transhumanist Wager. He also writes for publications such as Vice, the Huffington Post, Slate, and many more. Zoltan's received a ton of press attention recently, so I'm not going to go too far into his background in this interview. That's all addressed elsewhere, including in an appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast. But Zoltan's a controversial figure both in U.S. politics and in the transhumanist community. So what I'm interested in is what he really thinks about transhumanism and what drives him to do what he does. As always, all of our show notes can be found at our website at futuregrind.org. Please subscribe to our iTunes feed and our YouTube channel. We have a ton of great guests coming up and I wouldn't want you to miss anything. Thanks for tuning in. This is Future Grind. Hey Zoltan, welcome to Future Grind. We've gone through a bit of your background already, so let's jump right into it. You were the candidate for the United States presidency representing the Transhumanist Party. But how did you first find transhumanism? Why does it appeal to you?
Well, it's funny. I feel like a lot of people that get interested in transhumanism have had sort of a moment in life that sort of converted them to it, to saying, wow, I want something more than just being a human being. And, for me, I've had a number of different instances, either as a kind of a reporter in war zones or conflict zones, that made me want to live much longer through science. But it just happened to be when I was studying in college. I was 20 years old. I read an article on cryonics. And by the time I finished that article on cryonics, I was converted. I just really thought, wow, there's a way to hopefully eliminate death through science. This is a movement that I want to be a part of. And so that's sort of when it began, when I was just 20 years old.
You mentioned there that you worked previously as a reporter in war zones. What was that like, and what media outlets were you doing this work for?
Almost exclusively, it was for National Geographic Channel. I was with them for about 4 years, and so I did just a lot of different stories, but some of the more hardcore stories were in Pakistan and India, covering the Kashmir conflict. And, so a lot of I just had a really wonderful kind of, I guess it was the late 20s, early 30s, working for them, where I was just going around everywhere doing stuff. And a lot of the stories I covered were pretty heavy things. Generally, young journalists end up covering some of the more dangerous stories.
They definitely do, and I'm glad to see you made it back safely from that. In your novel, The Transhumanist Wager, the protagonist Jethro introduces a philosophy known as Teleological Egocentric Functionalism, or TEF. As an explanation for this philosophy, you had written, quote, TEF is predicated on logic, a simple wager that every human faces. If a reasoning human being loves and values life, they will want to live as long as possible, the desire to be immortal. Nevertheless, it is impossible to know if they are going to be immortal once they die. To do nothing doesn't help the odds of gaining immortality, since it seems evident that everyone will die someday and possibly cease to exist. To try something scientifically constructive towards ensuring immortality beforehand is the most logical conclusion. End quote. That's quite a statement, and something I'd love to dive into further. What is TEF in practical terms?
Well, TEF is really just a philosophy, and what I like to tell people, and many people don't know this, is that TEF is actually a bridge philosophy to artificial intelligence. I've told people before that, well, maybe a lot of people don't like the protagonist in the book. I'm guessing that thinking machines, will one day really appreciate that protagonist, because he is much more machine-like in his thinking, and he is much more cold and calculating. But TEF, essentially stands for kind of a very individualistic philosophy that is very much based on one trying to accumulate as much power as possible in order to protect their own existence. And everything else from that kind of statement just boils down, goes down and creates the philosophy. But the most important thing of TEF is that an individual wants to survive at all costs.
And is TEF a philosophy that you personally adopt? How does the philosophy of Jethro compare to the philosophy of Zoltan Istvan?
So, to be honest, I have been distancing my book now for almost a year because of my presidential campaign. TEF would never work to as a philosophy for a nation. And this brings up this discrepancy between whether individuals and societies actually have, their aims are mutually oriented. They may not be. At least Teff would say they're not, because Teff would ultimately say that the individual is searching for his own kind of well-being ahead of anyone else's. And that's why I distance myself from the book and from that philosophy, because when you're trying to run a country, it's much more about people. It's much more about society. It's much more about, taking care of the community that you're a part of. And honestly, I've said this before, I'm not necessarily even sure yet whether Teff is something that I embrace individually, or Teff is just something that I created as a way to challenge people to hopefully further their own philosophical aims, because it's very hard to practice Teff and have a family and have children like I do, because, ultimately, as the book brings up all these different scenarios, how far would you go to protect your life? Would you protect it over your wife's life, over your children's life? These are incredibly challenging decisions and challenging ideas to be made. And so the same thing comes kind of with your country. Do you serve your country first or yourself? And so Teff doesn't really work when you talk about politics, but it does very much work as a vehicle, a philosophical vehicle for getting us to find out how far we want to take science and technology in our lives, and especially if we want to use it to conquer death.
And as part of your mission to raise awareness about transhumanism and life extension science, you've completed a cross-country tour in your coffin-shaped bus known as the Immortality Bus. I'm sure in your travels you've encountered a number of people who were completely unaware that this movement was happening. What is your pitch to these people? How do you explain your presidential platform to them?
Well, right now, the Transhumanist Party is a very new and small political entity that is aiming to put science, technology, and health at the forefront of American politics. Our party is small. It's a non-membership party. It's really just a vehicle that people can support and say, well, there is this political entity out there that is trying to do something different than the other political parties. We're out there pushing science. We're out there pushing technology as a means of solving all the different problems in the world. And frankly, if you look at, according to World Bank reports, why the world has improved over the last 30, 40 years, it's almost exclusively because of technology. Technology is making there be less poverty. Technology is making us feed ourselves better. Technology is lowering the infant mortality, death rates, and stuff like that. So we're increasingly becoming a better world through science and technology. And what I try to say with the Transhumanist Party in my own presidential campaign is that can continue the more we emphasize science and technology. So therefore, we should spend a lot more time, instead of our morals and our religious values and stuff like that, we should spend time developing science and technology to make the world a better place.
And that pitch must be effective, because you've been getting a lot of media attention, both about your presidential campaign and the Immortality Bus tour. But I've noticed that you seem to be plagued by the same problems that other futurists and scientists face, and that is sensationalized media. Many of the headlines use controversial buzzwords to get clicks or to misrepresent. Do you feel that this misleads the public? Does it benefit or hurt the transhumanist community?
Well, there's kind of two issues there. The first is, if you just meet somebody on the street and ask them about transhumanism or tell them about it, they're almost certainly going to accept it. I mean, virtually everyone I met on my bus tour, crossing from San Francisco to Washington, D.C., was open to transhumanism. Doesn't matter if they were religious, didn't matter if they were, atheists, didn't matter who they were. Everyone wants to use science and technology to make their lives better. I mean, that's kind of a fact. But the problem is comes the second issue, is how the media handles it. Well, we must never forget, no matter what happens, that the media survives off commercials and ads. And those commercials and ads want to get as many people to buy their products. So you need news that is sensational. And this is a very serious issue our society faces, that the internet has made sensational news, clickbait, so easy to have. So, instead of saying, well, here's a guy who wants to, run for president on science and technology platform, they say, well, here's a guy who wants to conquer death and make us all immortal. And just even that little change in the headline actually is a very kind of sensationalistic kind of perspective, and it makes you just like, well, what kind of craziness is this? The problem with that is that, when we lose ourselves in sensationalism, especially in the media, we may not be getting the full story. But, I think as society progresses, we need to understand that news is always, news is being manipulated to some extent by the ads and the commercials it must sell. And so the more hits, the more clicks these things get. And so there always must be kind of this kind of, grain of salt taken with everything we read. And unfortunately, that same thing is happening with a huge amount of the media that is surrounding the Transhumanist Party and my campaign, is that it is a bit too sensational. It's too sensational for me, but I'm also glad to be covered. So there's kind of a catch-22 there that's going on.
Yeah, it's definitely a catch-22, and the fact that the news media is beholden to profits is absolutely a travesty. But I guess the definitions of the words news and entertainment are subjective, and more often than not, they blend in today's society. One controversial buzzword you seem to have adopted is the term transhumanist. Similar to perhaps how many people who may meet the definition of an atheist or a feminist disavow those terms because of a stigma attached to them, many futurists and technologists avoid the term transhuman. You, however, embrace the term. Why is that?
Well, so this is a great question, and a question I still think about a lot. I wrote an article for Slate and took a real long time thinking about it a while back on which word is the best word to use for the entire futurist world to move forward. And honestly, when you look at the different words, whether it be cyborg, whether it be posthuman, whether it be longevity science or life extension science or singularity, transhumanism was the word that seems to be the simplest and easiest way to convey an umbrella term to science and technology improving the human race. The problem, of course, is that historically speaking, anything with the word trans has been tied to, things that people for 30 or 40 years thought was not what they wanted or something like that. But I love the word trans. I always have thought the word trans is brilliant. Trans means beyond in Latin. And that's really what we're talking about. We're not, I'm not necessarily pushing a post-human era because I don't know if that's where I want to go. What I'm pushing is something that is beyond the human being. And it doesn't mean it can't be tied to the human being still. So I feel that transhumanism is the best word out there. I'm not going to promise you it's the perfect word because I myself thought a lot about it when I decided to name my book, The Transhumanist Wager. But I still continue to push the word because I know when you look at movements like the environmental movement, when the environmental movement started out 20 years ago, nobody knew what the word environmentalism was. Nobody thought in terms of green. But this is about 30, 40 years ago now, actually, when it started. But through people pushing and through small groups, kind of establishing themselves in the media, they made it so that virtually every person on the planet is now aware of some type of environmentalism. Everyone, would recycle now if they basically could. I mean, well, not everyone, but very close to everyone. This is a movement that has now become so widespread that it affects almost every person on the planet. I'm aiming to make transhumanism that same thing. It's a funny word now, but I think in 15 years or 20 years, we may not see it as funny. We may see it as the natural word that everyone kind of relates to and says, well, hey, this is great. This is a whole new generation has been brought up with it without thinking any of the loaded terms that came with it from the past. So I had to make this tough decision in all my writings and in naming my columns and stuff like that to which word to push. And transhumanism has been the word I've kind of gone with. And I continue to maintain that it still is the best one unless another one comes out that somehow satisfies me more.
Yeah, I understand that. I have no problems with the term. And while I don't introduce myself as a transhumanist, I certainly don't take offense or correct media outlets that refer to me as one. But there's a few ways to look at transhumanism. One is that we're already transhuman. That is, using technology, we have already overcome our biological limitations. From using rocks as hammers and axes on the African savanna, to wearing clothing, to using fire to cook our food, and thereby altering the biology of our mouth and digestive system, we've already evolved ourselves. This is ontological design. As Anne Marie Willis points out, we design our world and our world in turn designs us. We make the technology and the technology makes us who we are. Technology is an extension of our human capabilities, and some would say that therefore we are already transhuman. That's one way of looking at it. The second way I see it is, transhumanism is the carrot on the stick that's always dangling in front of us. When we talk about transhumanism today, we talk about man-machine integration, we talk about brain-computer interfaces, and gene editing, and radical life extension. If there was a conversation just a couple of hundred years ago about what it would mean to be beyond human, I can imagine a consensus being that the ability for humans to take to the sky, or leave the planet, or to communicate instantly with people anywhere in the world would be an example of transhumanism. Today, we can already do all of those things. I still consider myself human. For the people of the future, who design their own babies for the traits they want, who live to the age of 200, who choose to have a functioning biological limb removed in favor of a more capable mechanical model, will they consider themselves human? Will they look at us in the same way that we look at humans of centuries past? Will they have a new, even more extreme idea of what it would mean to one day be transhuman? I think so. So my question to you is, when do you think we'll finally be able to say, we are transhuman?
Well, so that's really funny, and I've actually recently thought about this. Is I think what a lot of the academics would say, and they're like, well, what is the difference between post-human and transhuman? For me, culturally speaking, transhuman is kind of where we are now. We're just sort of entering the transhumanist era. I suppose we started flying regularly at 30,000 feet across continents. That was sort of the beginning of that transhuman era. And of course, as we talk about cranial implants or chips in ourselves and bionics, this is really becoming truly the transhumanist age. But I think there will be a point when we get to an age that requires maybe a different word. I don't know if that's going to be post-humanism or what it's going to be, but there is a moment when I think maybe we're over 50% machine, let's say hypothetically. And that means, most of our organs are now bionic or something like that. We may choose a different term that becomes something like post-human era. But again, it's not. I don't want to pretend that I have necessarily found total peace with this. This word war has always been challenging to all futurists. And the problem with using the word futurist, which is such a general term, is that it doesn't really cover everything that we're speaking about, whereas transhuman specifically covers improving ourselves with science and technology, and not just sort of like improving the universe, which I think is more of a futurist term. And again, that's one of the reasons why I went with transhumanism. But I do think eventually, when we are probably over 50% machines or whatever it may be, then we may start looking at a different term that can help us understand.
Sure, there's no denying the fact that technology is changing the world in drastic ways. One problem that many futurists, including myself, have is that we see society, the politicians, the governments of the world, are not having the foresight to prepare for this. For example, technological unemployment is upon us. We see it all the time when we use a self-checkout line or a vending machine. Autonomous vehicles are almost here. And imagine the taxi and truck drivers that will be put out of work when this comes. AI will replace many jobs. Our current economic system is not equipped to handle this. Capitalism has done amazing things and innovated the world we see today, but it is also built on scarcity, and right now we are in the early stages of creating a society of abundance, in which pure capitalism will not be sustainable. So, we can either have the hard and controversial conversations now about things like universal basic income, universal health care, free education. We can have those conversations today, or we can wait until the robots replace our jobs and the starving masses revolt. Many politicians seem to choose the latter. This is concerning. If you win the presidency, how will you address this?
Well, so yeah, and I totally agree with you. It's amazing when you actually think of capitalism, because I've been a big supporter of capitalism. I've been an entrepreneur most of my life, but even I must recognize that in the last few years, there's no way that any rational person can continue to believe that capitalism can survive beyond 20 or 30 or 40 years, not without major revolts and not without a dystopic society appearing, which is one of the reasons why the Transhumanist Party has decided, and my campaign has decided, to support a universal basic income, is because we just can't see a way that you can constantly have, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poor, and technology affecting that. That doesn't lead to the kind of world I think we all wanted. But I think ultimately, one of the most important things to understand here is that there will be a great clash if we don't do something about it. In fact, why I was driving this crazy coffin bus called the Immortality Bus across the country recently, and I stopped and, the finale was delivering a transhumanist Bill of Rights to the U.S. Capitol building, was because we need to, ahead of time, not have a civil rights era battle again. We need to, this time, sit down and say, cyborgs will need rights. artificial intelligences will need rights. We can't just torture them if they feel pain. I mean, we already have robots that are starting to almost feel pain. I mean, we need now to sit down as a world and say, we're coming to a point when there will be different types of entities out there, and we ourselves will become them. We need to protect that right to do that. We need to protect the right to do with our bodies, especially when it concerns biohacking endeavors and stuff like that, that I really feel is leading science forward. We need to protect that and make sure that we have the right to do that. And this is very important. If we can do this, we can establish something like this ahead of time, then I think we can avoid the great conflicts that will come, of people versus transhumanists or whatever might be the future like that. But if we can, then there probably will be clashes in the streets. I'm pretty certain in the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see major civil rights disturbances between how fast technology is changing us and how fast the modern world is just, the future is coming.
Yeah, it's coming quickly, and that could be a big wake-up call for America, which seems incredibly unprepared for the future of technology. Look at examples like drones. Camera-equipped, personally owned drones are now commonplace. I have one myself. And the FAA is rushing to create regulations for this industry, and they are already years behind the technology. Self-driving cars are another example. The automobile company Tesla is showing that autonomous vehicle technology is almost ready, and it improves with every software update. But we're not legally ready to have consumer-owned, self-driving cars on the road. There are too many questions that we don't have answers for, and frankly, it's holding us back.
Oh, absolutely, and I think it's a tragedy. I mean, the one instance I always bring up is when George W. Bush stopped stem cell funding in this country for 7 years, federal stem cell funding. And what happened? Well, all the scientists, all the experts in this country left. They went to Italy, they went other places. The problem is, a lot of them never returned. So we had a brain drain from what is now stem cells becoming one of the most important advances in 21st century medicine. And what a shame to have America have lost that because of George W. Bush's religious convictions and also Congress's religious convictions. This is not something that should happen. This Transhumanist Bill of Rights we just delivered says this can no longer happen. If it goes against somebody's personal longevity or their personal health, the government does not have a right to step in just because culturally or religiously it believes something, from thousands of years ago. The standard of life has to be one's health. It has to be one's longevity, and nothing else really, should be able to, be above that. And I think if we can embrace some of these ideas, then we'll be able to move forward more quickly. But otherwise, we're not going to be the leader. And I've been, writing an article right now saying, look, the equivalent, in China, there's something that's equivalent to the FDA as we have here in America. But the FDA in China, their equivalent, doesn't have nearly as strict timelines and regulations for developing drugs. Well, if you're a drug inventor and you have to wait 7 or 8 years to invent a drug that's going to help people, you'd probably start that company in China because it's only going to take 2 or 3 years to get your approval there and start making money and start helping people. Well, if America doesn't get its act together, we're going to lose on so many different sides when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to all sorts of commercial things, that of course we're not going to be the leader anymore, and that's a sad state because I'm not running for president just because I want to make America better. I'm also running because I love this country. I think this country can be great and can do wonderful things, but it needs to pick up its game and it needs to kind of stop a lot of the red tape against science that it's had for decades now.
Yeah, I can speak to that firsthand. I was recently invited for a talk at a medical entrepreneur conference in Germany, alongside many innovative startup companies in the healthcare field. We had people like Dr. Daniel Kraft from Singularity University and many other great minds on hand. And one of the takeaways from that event for me was that there are companies in America now that, due to the fact that their disruptive technologies threaten established money-making industries, face too much lobbyist opposition working against them. So they have to take their innovations elsewhere and hope they can get their product approved in America once it's established in another country. This isn't good for anyone. So there's this whole idea of transhumanism and looking towards the future that I feel needs to be popularized. And speaking of philosophies, some of the ideas promoted in TEF remind me a bit of Ayn Rand's objectivism, the focus on individualism, the favor for one's rational self-interest, for example. Are there any books, authors, or philosophers that inspire you? What are you reading now?
Reading is so tough for me because it's just been months and months before I could really dive into a book because I've been so busy. The campaign has grown quite a lot, and I stick with a lot of the classics. Friedrich Nietzsche is definitely been something I revisit at least once a week just to be inspired by quotes. I got to be honest, I'm reading my own novel again for the very first time in probably 18 months. And so that's been interesting to do. Sometimes it can kill you because you find errors that you're like, oh, I should change, or you've grown from certain philosophies. But and mostly the reading that I try to do these days is in a lot of scientific journals because as a journalist and someone who writes frequently, I'm a lot of my presidential campaign. I think a lot of the success of it has been because as I also can write a huge amount of articles about it, and so I look for these diamonds in the rough of different ideas that are coming out in the scientific journals that will literally change us. And it's funny, I had this idea recently where I realized that it's very possible that the death penalty, for a long time, I think I'd been a supporter of it because I thought, oh, if someone does something awful, to one's family, then they shouldn't deserve to live. But then I realized that there's going to be technology out there very soon that will give people the option to have their mind and their personalities altered, either through cranial implants and stuff like that. So maybe as a civil society, we no longer should, entertain killing people, no matter what they've done. We should entertain changing them, or at least give them that choice to be changed. And that would be the more humane thing. I'm hoping, as both as a presidential candidate and as someone who loves science and technology, to make the world more humane. And so this is kind of a strange concept that I discovered through some scientific journal. But every single time I dig into these journals, I find more and more cool information that just makes me realize, wow, the institutions in society that we think we believe in, the think we've been with for decades and decades, many of them are going to change dramatically in the next 5 or 10 or even 15 years.
Yeah, you mentioned the criminal justice system there, and that's definitely something that America needs to address. Ideally, this would be a rehabilitation system, enabling people who have committed offenses to return to being a productive member of society, holding a job, paying taxes, etc. However, it seems that instead, the American system is a for-profit enterprise that ruins lives rather than providing people an opportunity to change and grow. And there's a resentment against services being provided to people in prison. For example, I recently debated someone about educating inmates. They said that this was unfair and that inmates don't deserve an education, despite the fact that statistics show that when inmates are provided an education, the rates of recidivism drop and people are more likely to get their lives back on track, making society a safer and more productive place. For me, I see controversial topics like education and healthcare as an investment. It betters society as a whole, rather than an undeserved handout that better one person. As a presidential candidate, would you agree with that assessment?
Well, yes, and I just despise our criminal justice system in America. I mean, it's absurd. We have so many more criminals than everyone else, and it's not because we have so many more criminals. It's because it's a giant money-making machine. It's a fact we spend 4 times the amount on the prison system than we do on education in America. This is perhaps the biggest tragedy of our nation right now. Well, I think the bigger tragedy is how much we spend on the military over science. But number 2 is definitely the fact that we spend so much more money on criminals than we do on educating our children. So, I have suggested, first off, just letting out all nonviolent offenders. But, there's tons of different technologies to track people these days if you want to track them, And the fact is, when you put criminals back into society and keep them away from criminals, there's peer pressure. If you put a criminal into a normal job, he tends to function better because he's surrounded by good people. And the thing is, we have drones, we have kind of RoboCops, we have all sorts of things to monitor people to make sure they're not doing terrible things. And because so many people in prison these days are nonviolent, it's just a matter of kind of very quickly putting them in the right environment so that they can contribute to the system. And of course, not only do we save money by not keeping them in prison and feeding them, they then start joining the tax-paying system. So now we have more money. And where would all that money go? Well, it would go into education. And, I have supported a mandatory college policy where, and this is a bit controversial, but I know for, a fact that anyone born today is very likely barring any tragedy, to live to 150 or at least 120 or 130. Well, our education requirements haven't changed since the 1960s in America. Except what has changed is we're living far longer lives. So any kind of teenager today has a very good chance of living to 120, 130. It should be just sort of pushed on people that we're going to make you go to college. And of course, I support an entirely free education system. In fact, I would support incentives to pay people to go to college, because I realize when you talk about getting money back from the system, you get money back from the system by the more education people have, because they earn more money. And even if robots take their jobs at some point 20, 30 years in the future, or 10 years in the future, it's still better to have an educated public, because that makes for a safer public. And these are some of the things that, the Transhumanist Party and myself have been advocating. Now, we don't advocate it saying we're going to rewrite rules immediately, but absolutely emptying prisons with nonviolent offenders should be, definitely a goal. And getting people to go to college and making it free, that's, of course, something else that I would love to do. Can you imagine if everyone on the street was college educated and just simply had a good time? We've even advocated for saying that anyone that finishes a year of college then gets 1 year of paid travel around the world via the government. This is the kind of thing people need, to go out there and explore yourselves, have drugs, do drugs, have sex, have some crazy times, as opposed to joining some gang or something and shooting people, or, having a better chance of being thrown in jail, or just even going to work at Walmart. We can have our citizens become people that can end up doing anything they want to do, going and doing multiple PhDs. We should strive to try to push everyone to do that.
Yeah, there's a sense in modern America that if people don't need to work, they become lazy and no longer want to be productive members of society. Sure, there are wealthy people who might spend their time sitting by a pool, but look at people like Richard Branson, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg, just to name a few. These people have the resources to never work a day in their lives and live in luxury. They choose to work for the betterment of mankind. They want to better themselves, cure disease, promote clean energy, open up space, and connect the world. I think that's what most humans would do if they had the resources to follow their dreams. It's certainly what I would do.
Yeah, no, and when you talk about bettering themselves, the great thing about it is that most people, especially if they have more education, will probably end up wanting to better themselves through science and technology. And this, of course, is the grand plan, where we become a transhumanist-minded planet, where science and education and technology and reason become sort of the main drivers of who we are as a species. And currently, I got to be honest, as you know it from living in America, some of the main drivers are either commerce or religion or something else like that. But I would love it to be science, technology, education, and reason. If we can do that, I think we could become that kind of much more utopic. Without sounding too sci-fi, we could become that civilization that really has a very, very brilliant existence, with a lot less war, a lot less crime, and a lot more innovation and brilliance than we perhaps ever had thought possible of ourselves.
Absolutely, and these are the conversations we need to be having. These should be the debates that are happening in Congress, but they aren't. Instead of talking about connecting the world and curing disease, we're talking about building walls and dropping bombs. Look, I spent some time working in a congressional office on Capitol Hill. It's a fascinating process. I loved it. But it's also frustrating. And one interesting thing that stuck out to me while I was there, I heard a few members of Congress discuss how God told them to run, how the Bible is their guide when determining policy. As people like Richard Dawkins point out, not being religious is pretty much a guarantee that you aren't going to be elected to any noteworthy public office. But I recently heard something that I still find hard to believe. Not only has there never been an atheist U.S. president, there has never even been a moderately well-known U.S. presidential candidate. That is, until you.
Well, it's amazing. I assumed after 250 years that this couldn't be true. There must have been a number of other atheists running, but it turns out that I just couldn't find them. And when I researched it, I was like, wow, there's really no one that has done it like that. And what does that say about a society? What does it say about us when all 535 members of Congress, all 9 Supreme Court justices, and are present is religious? That's 100% right now. Okay, now maybe there's some stragglers who are just pretending, but the reality is it's such a high percentage that are religious that it's astonishing. It's shocking. It's embarrassing, frankly, too, because the rest of the world is not like that, especially Europe. I'm happy to try to carry the torch forward with this atheism thing, but it's not something that I really want to do. It just happens to be the way it's happening. And I wish people and the public and our government would be able to make choices outside of their feelings of religion, their feelings of faith. Faith should have nothing to do with governing people. And that's a fact. I mean, it's a very simple. I mean, I know it's not necessarily a fact, but we should be using reason and the scientific method when it comes to determining what's in the best interest of our people. To use faith because you have this idea that may have been given to you as a child that you had no chance of refusing. This is not a way to run a government or a way to run a people. So, when I say atheism, and of course, all atheists like myself have no idea if God exists. I say atheism in a kind of a defiant manner. I'm obviously much more of an agnostic in the sense that I just don't know. And the great thing about atheists is they're all open-minded enough to say, well, we just don't know. We tend to not believe in God because there's no evidence. But the reality is, it's impossible to know. But you'll never find a religious person like that saying that. They'll all say they know for sure. And this is very damaging to society and very damaging to culture and to government when people think they know something. Nobody really knows much around here. Our eyes can see about 1% of the universe's light spectrum. Our ears can hear a fraction of the sound waves in the universe. The human being carrying it with its 3-pound bag of meat on its head doesn't know squat. We're just even touching what we can kind of know through some of the machines we're building. So when we talk about running ourselves as a nation and controlling 25,000 nuclear weapons around the world, we have to be very careful. We're very, very young. We're like little babies in the universe. And we need to take it slow and say, we're going to be hurt ourselves if we don't take more care to use more reason and the scientific method with everything that we do. And I don't want to discount the human race. We've done wonderful, but it amazes me when we think about what we can become and when we look back, what we're going to look back at. The way we look back on primates now is very much in 100 to 200 years, what we're probably going to look back on in human beings in 2016.
Yeah, religious belief is rampant in our government. From Kim Davis to Mike Huckabee, you see these faith-based theocratic ideals pushing political action. I think a lot of this is because people don't often criticize religion, because doing so is seen as taboo. Sam Harris pointed this out nicely in a debate with Rabbi David Wolpe. He said that outlandish beliefs are constrained by our common sense in every other domain of discourse, and he uses the example of people who believe that Elvis is still alive. If someone says they saw Elvis, or Elvis spoke to them, or they see Elvis in you, they pay a price. These beliefs are shamed, and that's often a good thing, a productive thing for society. The same can be said of anti-vaxxers, or people believe that reptilians control the world, or that the moon landings were faked. But for some reason, these faith-based claims are mocked, while religious faith-based claims are viewed as protected. We need to change this. Again, Richard Dawkins. He endorses the Out campaign, promoting that people need to be openly secular and reach out, speak out, and stand out about their beliefs. I totally agree with this. This needs to happen. If we want rational free thought and science to have a chance to make the world a better place, religious myth has to be knocked off its pedestal. Since this shows no sign of happening soon in America, people who want to achieve immortality might have to hold on to life until these technologies are developed. There's a lot of contradictory information on current ways to extend your life. Diet plans, exercise plans, etc. There was recently a lot of press for Ray Kurzweil, who takes hundreds of pills and supplements a week for this purpose. There's also the Longevity Cookbook by Maria Konovalenko, and the various body hacking recommendations from people like Tim Ferriss and Dave Asprey. Do you follow any supplement, diet, or exercise program to extend your lifespan?
It's such a good question. Unfortunately, I do well in a lot of other things in the transhumanist community, and I guess hopefully representing some of it. But I don't do that much for my health right now. I run or swim every day, but I still drink too much. Not that I'm an alcoholic or anything like that, of course, but I do enjoy a glass of wine or two or even three or a glass of scotch or two a night. And it's something that I probably will pull back on here as I'm getting older. But right now at 42 years old, I've I feel like I'm as strong, or I'm in the epitome of my health. So I understand that while a lot of people take their health very seriously, and a lot of transhumanists take a lot of pills, I guess I just haven't been worried about that because I'm still so young. So I can't really give the best advice, but I do support all of it. I think the more pills people take, if they make sense, I'm a big fan of nootropics, stuff like that. So if people want to do that, that's wonderful stuff. But for me, I'm just exercising daily and trying to not be too stressed out too.
Yeah, exercise and stress relief sounds like great advice there. Thanks so much for sitting down with me for this. And I just have one last question for you. I'm sure many people, like I am, are fascinated with transhumanism, longevity science, and using science and technology to better humanity. For people who want to get involved and make this a reality, what would you recommend?
If anyone not sure what they want to do with their career, but they want to join the transhumanist movement, become a journalist. There just aren't enough journalists out there right now that have access to leading publications that can write positively about transhumanism. And I find that one of the most difficult things about the movement is that we need more people that are able to get into the media to promote it. Because if you just let the media cover transhumanism, they're almost always going to cover it from a skeptical, negative position. But if you have a transhumanist in the media writing about it or covering it, he's going to cover it positively. He or she will cover it positively. And this makes all the difference in how the public views the movement. So if there are anyone out there, any of your listeners that are thinking about careers, please, journalism is a wonderful career, and it's going to be around for a while, I think. And the more we can do that turns transhumanism positively, at least in the media, is very helpful for the movement. Because in the end of the day, much of my presidential campaign, much of what I'm trying to do as a popularizer of these concepts is to get the public to think differently about science and technology. If the public can become welcoming to transhumanist technology, welcoming to chip implants, welcoming to bionic arms, welcoming to artificial hearts, they're going to elect people into government that will spend the money to make that happen. If they are super religious and they find this is all like mark of the beast stuff, then they're not going to support it. So for us, journalists and us who are in doing publicity things, it's really important to try to paint transhumanism as something positive for the general public and positive for the world as a whole. So I definitely, every time someone asks me, what should I do to help transhumanism? Go into journalism.
Yeah, that's very important. And with the democratization of the internet and the free spread of knowledge, anyone can do this. So I second that. If you're listening to this and want to help science and technology, please share this podcast on your social media accounts, blog about it, listen to it with your friends, and get that conversation started. Your life might just depend on it. Thanks again, Zoltan. It was great having you on the show, and we'll have to do this again soon.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Future Grind podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. As always, all of our show notes can be found at our website at futuregrind.org. Please subscribe to our iTunes feed and our YouTube channel. We have a ton of great guests coming up, and we wouldn't want you to miss anything. Please like, comment, rate, share this with your friends. Really spread the word. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope to see you next time on Future Grind.